The desert was silent before dawn. A fine mist of dust floated in the still air, clinging to steel and sweat alike. Inside a line of camouflaged Italian M1340 tanks, men waited, cramped in their metal coffins, surrounded by the smell of fuel and warm oil. The engines idled softly, their vibrations steady but uncertain, like the heartbeat of men who already knew what was coming. Corporal Ricci glanced through his periscope. A narrow slit framed by grime. The horizon shimmered, empty but alive with a faint hum. It wasn't the wind. It was deeper, steadier, mechanical. Through the haze, dark shapes emerged. At first they seemed like any other enemy armor, but as they drew nearer, the silhouettes grew taller, broader, tanks that looked alien in their proportions. Smooth turrets, long barrels, and wide tracks pressing the sand flat beneath them. The radio cracked. A faint, distorted voice warning of nuovi carri americani. New American tanks. Moments later, the first shell screamed overhead. A dull explosion tore through the sand, shaking the M13's thin armor. The crew froze. They hadn't even fired yet. This was the morning Italian tankers learned what hopeless felt like. By early 1943, the North African campaign had entered its final and most decisive phase. For nearly 2 years, the deserts of Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia had served as a brutal testing ground, a place where strategy, endurance, and technology clashed under the merciless sun. The Italian forces, once confident under the banners of the Regio Esercito, now fought in a vastly changed war. When they first entered North Africa in 1940, Italy's leadership believed that speed and mobility could compensate for limited firepower. Their armored divisions, equipped with vehicles like the M1139 and later the M1340, were meant to move fast, strike hard, and retreat before heavier opposition could organize. But the desert had its own logic. Mobility meant little when the enemy could see you coming across endless miles of flat sand. Speed meant nothing when heat choked your engines and dust clogged your air filters. And courage, no matter how abundant, could not make riveted armor thicker. By 1941, the Italians were already struggling against British Matildas and Crusaders, whose heavier armor and longer-range guns easily outmatched the M1340's 47mm cannon. It was the arrival of Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps that temporarily altered the balance. German panzers brought speed and tactical finesse, while the Italians provided the bulk of manpower and logistical support. Together, they fought with remarkable coordination across Libya and Egypt. Victories at places like Tobruk and Gazala rekindled hope in Rome. Yet beneath the surface of those triumphs lay an uncomfortable truth. Italian tanks were falling behind with every passing month. The M1340, introduced in 1940, was already obsolete by the time it rolled into North Africa. Its riveted hull, thin armor, and underpowered diesel engine left it vulnerable to almost every Allied gun fielded by 1942. Its 125-horsepower engine struggled in the deep sand, and the rivets could become lethal projectiles when struck by enemy fire, tearing through the interior like shrapnel. The men inside these machines, however, were not ignorant of their flaws. They understood them intimately. Every mechanic's wrench, every overheating engine, every jammed gun reminded them of what they lacked. Yet still they fought, with professionalism, with quiet determination, and with a soldier's stubborn belief that courage might bridge the gap where steel could not. Then came the Americans. When U.S. forces landed in North Africa during Operation Torch in November 1942, the balance shifted permanently. The Allies brought with them something that neither courage nor strategy could overcome: industrial superiority. The M4 Sherman tank, produced by the thousands in Detroit, became the mechanical embodiment of that advantage. The Sherman was not a perfect machine. It wasn't the heaviest or the most heavily armed tank of the war, but it was reliable, consistent, and simple to maintain. It was, above all, modern, designed for efficiency, not elegance. Where the M1340 carried 30 millimeters of armor, the Sherman's sloped plates reached up to 75 millimeters in effective thickness. Where the Italian tank's gun could barely pierce 45 millimeters at 500 meters, the Sherman's 75 millimeter cannon could destroy an M1340 from well beyond visual range. But perhaps the most decisive difference lay in the philosophy behind each design. The M1340 represented a Europe still thinking in terms of World War I, small production runs, craftsmanship, and improvisation. The Sherman represented America's new vision of war: mass production, standardization, and mechanical precision. For Italian crews who had grown used to coaxing every ounce of performance from their fragile tanks, facing the Sherman was like confronting the future itself. As the campaign shifted into Tunisia, that future rolled steadily closer, one tank column at a time. By 1943, the war in North Africa had become a crucible, a place where heat, dust, and machinery decided the fate of nations. For Italy's tank crews, it was a lesson written in metal and sand. When the Regio Esercito first entered the desert in 1940, its leaders believed mobility would be their greatest weapon. The M1340, their primary tank, was seen as modern, diesel-powered, lightly armored, and fast enough to strike before the enemy could respond. But the desert was merciless. The heat crippled engines, the sand chewed through gears, and visibility stretched for miles, leaving no room for surprise. Against the British, these flaws were costly. Against the Americans, they would become fatal. In late 1942, U.S. forces landed in North Africa. Alongside British armor came a new machine, the M4 Sherman. It wasn't the most powerful tank in the world, but it was reliable, adaptable, and mass-produced by the thousands. The contrast was staggering. The Italian M1340, with its riveted armor and 47mm gun, looked and felt like a relic beside the smooth, welded lines of the Sherman. One was built with craftsmanship, the other with industry. One was designed for bravery, the other for efficiency. And in war, efficiency wins. As the two sides prepared to clash in the Tunisian sands, Italian crews knew what waited beyond the horizon: something faster, stronger, and utterly modern. But still, they climbed into their tanks, checked their guns, and believed they could make a difference. Because courage doesn't calculate odds, the Tunisian front became the final chapter of Italy's desert campaign. By early 1943, Axis supply lines were collapsing under Allied air superiority. Fuel was scarce, spare parts almost non-existent, and every kilometer of sand felt heavier than the last. Italian divisions like the Ariete and Littorio, once proud and mobile, were now ghosts of their former strength. Their tanks were patched together from whatever remained. Armor plates scavenged from wrecks, engines rebuilt from scrap. Yet the men inside them still held formation, their discipline unbroken even as the desert turned against them. Opposite them, the Americans advanced with growing confidence. Their Shermans rolled off landing craft in endless lines, fresh, standardized, and identical. Each one carried the same tools, the same ammunition, the same spare parts. When one broke down, another took its place. When one burned, factories back home replaced it within days. To the Italians, this was not merely a battle. It was a glimpse into the future of warfare. The age of hand-built machines and limited resources was ending. Industrial power, not courage, was now the ultimate weapon. Still, Italian tankers fought on. They ambushed convoys, used dunes for cover, and struck in twilight to mask their weaknesses. But each encounter with the Sherman revealed the same truth. Their shells bounced harmlessly off its sloped armor, while American rounds tore through their hulls with mathematical precision. By the spring of 1943, the outcome was no longer in question. Yet among the dust and destruction, there remained something deeply human: the determination to keep fighting, even when logic said stop. Because in every war, before defeat, comes realization. From the outside, tank warfare looks like a clash of machines, armor, firepower, and maneuver. But inside, it was a test of nerve. In the M1340, the Italian crew operated in unbearable heat, each breath filled with oil and dust. The narrow steel walls amplified every sound, the rattle of treads, the echo of their own heartbeat. Communication was shouted, short, mechanical. The commander's world was a single slit of light. He judged range and target through instinct and experience, not technology. The gunner, kneeling in the cramped turret, had to reload manually after every shot, guiding the shell into place with sweat-slick hands. Every movement was ritual, rehearsed until it replaced thought. Across the desert, the Sherman crew lived differently. Their cabin was larger, their controls smoother. The gunner used a powered turret, a small mechanical advantage that changed everything. Their radios worked clearly, their engines started reliably, even after long nights in freezing sand. This was the contrast between two philosophies of design. The M1340 was crafted like a soldier's weapon, simple, compact, hand-built by a nation with limited steel and limited time. The Sherman was a factory product, standardized, replaceable, built by a nation that treated war like an equation. When the two met, the result was not just destruction. It was revelation. Italian crews began to understand. They were fighting not another army, but another world, one where precision engineering replaced improvisation, and where victory came from systems, not singular acts of bravery. Inside those tanks, courage was equal. But outside, technology had chosen its side. The second angle was industrial, the invisible war of factories and logistics that shaped the desert battlefield long before the first shot was fired. Italy's armored divisions depended on limited production from Fiat and Ansaldo, where tank design followed outdated doctrines born from the First World War. Each N1340 took weeks to assemble. Its riveted hull required manual labor, and parts were scarce. When one tank broke down, another had to be stripped for spares. Supply convoys from Europe struggled through the Mediterranean under constant attack, leaving crews to fight not only the enemy, but the silence of empty fuel drums and missing ammunition crates. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States had become the arsenal of democracy. Detroit alone could produce more tanks in a month than Italy in a year. The Sherman rolled off assembly lines like clockwork, standardized bolts, welded armor, interchangeable engines. A tank damaged in battle could be repaired overnight, its parts replaced without hesitation. That difference reshaped the nature of battle. For Italy, every tank lost was irreplaceable. For the U.S., every tank lost was an expected number in a production schedule. One fought a war of preservation, the other, a war of momentum. Even the fuel told two stories. The Italian diesel engines were efficient but slow, struggling to ignite in the cold desert mornings. The Sherman's gasoline engines roared to life instantly, consuming more fuel but delivering unstoppable mobility. So when the M1340s faced Shermans in Libya, the confrontation wasn't just mechanical. It was industrial philosophy in motion. The Shermans represented mass efficiency. The Italians handcrafted defiance. In that contrast, the outcome was already written, not in courage or tactics, but in the rhythm of production lines thousands of miles away. The desert was still. A faint wind moved across the dunes, carrying the smell of oil and dust. It was early morning, March 1942, near Gazala, west of Tobruk. Italian tankers sat in their M1340s, engines idling in the heat, vision slits narrowing against the glare. Somewhere beyond the shimmering horizon, American-made Shermans of the British Eighth Army were advancing. The Italians fired first. Their guns cracked through the silence, the 47mm shells streaking toward distant silhouettes. Each round left a short trail of dust, vanishing against armor too thick, too sloped. The shells sparked and bounced, leaving only shallow dents. Then the Shermans replied. From over a kilometer away, their 75mm cannons opened fire. Deep, resonant thunder that rolled across the desert. The first Italian tank erupted in black smoke. The second followed seconds later, struck through the side before its crew could even traverse the turret. Inside the Italian formation, voices shouted through the intercoms, orders drowned by engine noise and fear. The M1340 tried to reposition, their tracks digging into soft sand. They fired again, closer now, but each hit seemed futile, each shell too light, too slow. Through the haze, the Shermans advanced steadily, almost rhythmically. Their engines growled like a single machine, moving with confidence born of superiority. The Italian gunners fought on, adjusting their aim, refusing to retreat, but every second narrowed the distance between courage and inevitability. One Italian commander watched his shells strike a Sherman's front plate. Nothing. He lowered his head, gave the order to fire again, though he already knew the outcome. By midday, the battlefield was a sea of flame and dust. Italian tanks burned silently beneath the sun, their defeat sealed not by weakness, but by the future itself. By noon, the desert was no longer silent. It howled, with fire, metal, and the cries of men trapped in steel. Inside a Sherman, British gunner Corporal Hughes wiped sweat from his eyes, adjusting his sight on another target. Range 800, his commander said calmly. Hughes fired. The shell struck the Italian tank square in the turret. A blinding flash followed, then silence. Through his scope, he saw the hatch burst open, smoke pouring out like a sigh. The Italian formation was collapsing, yet amidst the chaos, one crew refused to yield. Lieutenant Marco Bellini, commanding an M1340, rallied his men. "We fight," he said through gritted teeth, "until the fuel or the heart runs dry." They shifted positions, using the wrecks of their comrades as cover. Bellini's gunner lined up a shot on an approaching Sherman's flank. Boom! This time, the shell penetrated. The British tank halted, flames licking from its side. For a moment, hope flickered. But then 3 Shermans turned their turrets in unison. Their cannons roared. The shockwave rolled through the sand like thunder. Bellini's tank shuddered. The world went white, then black. When the smoke cleared, only fragments remained, of tanks, of courage, of a battle already decided by design and destiny. Overhead, RAF fighters circled lazily, the vultures of modern war. The Italian and German observers on the ridge watched in disbelief. The Americans' machine, heavier, faster, steadier, had rewritten the rhythm of combat. The M1340, once Italy's pride, now looked like a relic. Its riveted armor and narrow gun were ghosts from another era, a reminder that bravery could never replace evolution. As night fell over the desert, the flames still glowed, the last heartbeat of an army overtaken by history itself. When dawn returned to the desert, it revealed the wreckage of a nation's military dream. Dozens of Italian tanks lay silent, burnt-out hulls scattered across the dunes like forgotten monuments. The sand, once golden, was now streaked black with oil and smoke. The Battle of Beta Fam had ended not in valor, but in revelation. Italian commanders standing amid the wreckage understood the truth. The M1340 had not failed because its crews lacked courage. It had failed because its design belonged to another time. Captured reports from the British 7th Armored Division noted how most Italian shells had bounced harmlessly off the Sherman's frontal armor. The psychological impact was devastating. Many Italian gunners had fired until their cannons overheated, only to watch their rounds spark uselessly against superior steel. In Rome, engineers studied the reports with grim faces. They had built tanks for colonial policing, not for the thunderous duels of modern mechanized war. Italy's industrial base simply could not match American output or British innovation. For the Americans, the engagement was a field test and a success. The M4 Sherman proved its balance between mobility, armor, and firepower. Its reliability would make it the backbone of Allied armored divisions for years to come, from North Africa to Normandy. For the Italians, it marked an ending. The M1340's defeat symbolized the crumbling of fascist illusions, of technological parity, of empire, of destiny. Still, those who survived remembered the courage of the crews, men who went into battle knowing their tanks were obsolete and fought anyway. Their bravery could not change history, but it carved something else into memory, that even the weakest machine in the hands of the determined can burn brightly before fading into legend. In the weeks that followed, Allied intelligence teams scoured the wrecked battlefields of North Africa. What they found confirmed everything the tankers had witnessed firsthand. The Italian Armored Corps was operating with vehicles a generation behind their enemies. Reports compiled by British analysts in 1941 described the M1340 as courageously crude but catastrophically designed. Its armor, riveted instead of welded, often became a weapon against its own men. When struck, the rivets could shear off and ricochet inside the crew compartment like shrapnel. The gun, though accurate at short range, lacked the velocity to pierce a Sherman's sloped frontal plate. Even the German Panzer III, once its equal, had by now evolved beyond comparison. Italy's tanks were museum pieces in a modern war. Mechanics on the ground were forced to improvise, bolting sandbags or spare tracks onto their hulls for extra protection. Some welded captured British cannons onto their turrets, desperate to keep pace with the changing face of battle. But no amount of ingenuity could compensate for outdated metallurgy, underpowered engines, and thin armor. By 1943, as Italy's war effort crumbled and Mussolini's regime faltered, the M1340 had all but disappeared from frontline service. Those that remained were scavenged for parts or abandoned in the dust. The Sherman, meanwhile, would roll triumphantly through Sicily, Italy, France, and finally into Germany itself, the unstoppable symbol of Allied industry and coordination. Yet even amid that triumph, Allied officers often noted a quiet respect for the Italian crews they had faced. They fought with the discipline of professionals trapped by circumstance, soldiers who obeyed orders even when the machines beneath them belonged to another age. And that haunting contrast, bravery within futility, would linger long after the smoke cleared. The story of Italy's tankers in World War II is not one of triumph, but of endurance. The kind of endurance born from duty rather than victory. These were men who climbed into machines they knew were outmatched. They fought not for conquest, but for survival, and for the honor that soldiers cling to even when the odds are impossible. The M1340 was never a bad tank because its crews lacked courage. It was a bad tank because it came from a nation unprepared for the industrial demands of modern war. Italy's factories could not match the mass production of the United States, nor the technological precision of Germany. Every tank they built was a compromise. Thin armor for mobility, light guns for economy, hope in place of resources. And yet, even within those limits, Italy's soldiers carried themselves with the same pride and fear that defined all men of that generation. They crossed deserts that seemed endless, endured supply lines that collapsed faster than their morale, and stood their ground against enemies who had every advantage that science and steel could offer. For them, the war was not just fought in sand and fire. It was fought in the hollow space between courage and inevitability. Each engagement became a testament to the human spirit's refusal to yield, even when the machine itself had already lost the battle. When historians study the North African campaigns, they often measure success in miles gained or tanks destroyed. But beneath those numbers lies a quieter truth, that even the weakest army can teach us something about strength. The Italian tankers, buried in the dunes of Libya and Tunisia, remind us that bravery is not defined by the power of one's weapon, but by the willingness to fight on despite knowing how the story will end. In the end, their defeat was inevitable. But their courage, that stubborn refusal to surrender to despair, remains immortal. And so, as we look back across the fading photographs and rusting wrecks of the M1340s scattered in desert silence, we are reminded that not every legacy in war is written by the victors. Some are carved, quietly and eternally, into the courage of those who fought, knowing they could not win.